I'm excited for the conversation here, Jerry, and really be able to dig in, to this carbon intensity webinar series that we've been hosting, and just go, I think, the next steps further into the science behind this stuff and into, okay, how do we better understand this, and why is this conversation happening, and why are people pushing on it so much, and all that kind of thing. So, but to tee it up, I'm Mitchell Hora. I'm the founder and CEO at Continuum Ag, and we're a software company that helps farmers implement regenerative ag practices. And we've been really focused on this carbon intensity avenue, mostly because of the concept and the thesis behind it, which is documenting the things that we're doing on our farm, turn that into a quantified environmental outcome, get that verified. So you got to be able to back it all up, and be able to open up marketplace opportunities that reward low environmental outcomes in premium driven markets. So the story of how you farm and the outcome of how you farm connected with the product into the supply chain. The 45Z tax credit is pushing a lot of this and pushing it in the renewable fuel space. But again, I like the concept for everything beyond just renewable fuels. So my guest here today is Dr. Jerry Hatfield, retired USDA ARS soil scientist. And I still call it the Soil Tilth Lab, Jerry, but director of the Soil Tilth Lab. I know you get a slap on the wrist for saying that. And I think, shoot, it changed its name way before I was involved in the space. But now it's something along the lines of lab for, it's got a way longer name. The name is like 8 pages long, but something along the lines of lab for ag and the environment. I think that's right.
Yep.
But anyway, so Jerry, thank you for jumping on. I want to talk today on, kind of the science behind this stuff, how the models are working. We do have some other webinars that we've recorded. Everything is up on our Continuum Ag YouTube page. Just Google or just go to YouTube, Continuum Ag, and there's a playlist that has all of our previous webinars. But Jerry, with that, I appreciate you being on. I appreciate you helping us out to understand this as a company, and helping us, figure out how do we tile this within TopSoil, within our systems, and just figuring out how do we take all of these concepts further for our customers. But Jerry, again, thank you for being on. Maybe tee yourself up just a little bit, and I'll help drive things along. And if anyone's got questions, I mean, we can definitely jump in or put it in the chat. We'll have plenty of time for questions at the end too, but happy to get to them as we go.
So tee up my first slide there, Mitchell. There we go. Yeah, Mitchell asked me to talk about carbon intensity and scientific background. And just to amplify my background a little bit, I've spent 45 years in research from 1975 to 2020, working on this whole soil plant atmosphere continuum and looking at the dynamics of not only carbon, but water, as well as nitrogen, and this whole thing that we don't understand in terms of carbon, water, nitrogen interactions, which drives agricultural systems. But when you get into this, I want to echo a statement that Mitchell made in terms of the emphasis on looking at carbon intensity. And if you go back and look at all of this, I mean, DOE continually puts out reports on how much emissions we get out of agriculture in every segment of our economy. Agriculture is really about less than 10% of the overall greenhouse gas emissions, but ag is still being looked at in terms of what we can do to offset carbon emissions from other places. And it's really, carbon intensity now puts a different focus on that. And I think that the focus is really in looking at the next step in taking now emissions and sequestration and dynamics all together and looking at it from an entirely different viewpoint. Mitchell, you can just go.
I got you.
Oh, well, there we go. So let's just look at the definitions in this and go back, and it really is in carbon intensity, it's simply the amount of energy expressed in greenhouse gas equivalents per unit of biomass, either forage or grain produced. And a lot of people think it's a lot more complex than that, but in reality, it's how much greenhouse gas we put in to produce something.
Yeah.
And in what we're looking at and what we're talking about is up to the farm gate. And what do we roll out in terms of bushels of corn or bushels of soybeans or wheat or anything else that's out there, and all of this. So that's kind of the definition everybody needs to stick with as we go through this. Let's go to the next one, Mitchell.
Yeah, and it's kind of like it's putting the lines in the sand is how I think about it. The lines in the sand around the acre and around that bushel of production. So it doesn't include your jet ski and your lake house or the cruise that you went on, Jerry. You don't have to worry about that. At least for right now, the line in the sand is around the acre, and it's here's your greenhouse gas impact per bushel, pound of meat, gallon of ethanol, whatever it may be, mostly ethanol and stuff, but it'll be meat and everything else here as we go.
So, it's very important to keep the idea of this, the idea that that boundary that we're talking about is the farm. That's right. In all of this. So, and then there's another little piece of this puzzle that we need to understand, because and when we talk about greenhouse gas equivalents, carbon dioxide has a greenhouse gas equivalent of 1. Methane is a greenhouse gas equivalent of 28. Nitrous oxide, in USDA's estimates, it's 265. DOE uses 298. And so there's still some controversy about this. But let me explain that. It says that why methane and nitrous oxide have such a big impact is that 1 unit of nitrous oxide is worth 265 units of CO2. And so, and since nitrous oxide is more related to fertilizers, we'll see a little bit later, is it says that we can have a major impact by how we manage nitrogen as part of this puzzle, because that 265 multiplier. Methane is really out of manure and animal production in all of this. And then, you start looking at digesters, you look at all this, but it's a 28 to 1 comparison and all of this. So everybody kind of needs to keep these numbers in mind, because they tell you how big the stack is when we start talking about management practices out there. Let's go to the next one.
Yeah, and that's why certain things influence more than others. I a lot of times, like for easier math, think of these as 30 and 300. So now that's closer to the 295 or 298 number that you had shared, and maybe that's why I was have heard it rounded to 30 and 300. But one quick follow-up on that. It's my understanding that a lot of that impact is mostly because of how long these greenhouse gases stick around in the atmosphere. Is that kind of?
Yeah, that's it's really longevity in the atmosphere. So you can think that rounded up 300 number on nitrous oxide is it's going to stay there. So if CO2 stayed in the atmosphere 1 year, nitrous oxide would stay there 300 years. And it's just really about degradation. But if you think about any of these greenhouse gases, and it's when we talk about a greenhouse gas equivalent, it's really about how effective that gas is in trapping energy in the Earth's atmosphere. And so solar radiation comes in, and you've all been in a greenhouse during the winter. Solar radiation goes through the glass, it comes out, it can't escape back out. So it gets very warm in a greenhouse, even though it may be below freezing outside. Well, that's what's going on in our atmosphere, is that the more of these gases we put in, the more effective we are at capturing that solar radiation and keeping it near the Earth's surface. There's one other gas that's important in all of this that we don't put into greenhouse gas equivalents, and that's water vapor. What happens in a cloudy night, it doesn't get near as cool because we trap all that energy in that. So you get this piece of the puzzle, and ag has to realize that on our when we start really getting a lot of transpiration and evaporation going on and putting water in there, is that we're influencing our microclimate as well.
Sure.
And so we can have a longer talk about
that's a whole nother webinar on that one,
that's
huh?
a whole nother seminar that I give. And if you think about this, and where this comes from, is this is the DOE out of Argonne, where a lot of the carbon intensity work is done, where they developed the GREET model. But I pulled this diagram out of that because I think it now gets instructive to start looking and saying, how do we begin to look at carbon intensity? And so if you look at this cradle to farm gate activities in all of this, we've got energy going in, diesel, gasoline, natural gas, that go into the manufacturing our inputs, fertilizers and chemicals. And then we've got the raw material that goes with that as well, hydrogen, chlorine, ammonia, all those different things. But those are in terms of a manufacturing process. And in the overall carbon intensity, we have to account for what it takes to generate ammonia fertilizer or urea or even the herbicides that are out there. And then you start putting that into the producing of what we want in terms of feedstock, is that we also have to realize that there's energy that goes into that. There's diesel, gasoline, natural gas. So we've got an energy input and we've got a product input. And then out of that, we get CO2 emissions because of application coming out. We've got nitrous oxide emissions from soils, and that will explain a lot. We've got land management changes, tillage intensity, cover crops, all those different things. The bottom line is that we can end up calculating how much emission there is per unit of or metric ton of biomass produced. And that biomass can either be tons of corn, tons of soybeans. I mean, if we're talking about a silage crop, we could talk about tons of dry matter going on, or any forage crop out there. So it's generic from all this standpoint, but this gives you an idea that there are multiple streams of things that are related to the carbon intensity score that's out there. So that's a general framework. We're going to delve into the bits and pieces of this as we go along. So let's just go to the next
We'll
one.
keep you rolling because I got so many questions, but I know you're gonna answer most of them. So
I hope so. So anyway, I pulled out some example values that the DOE has come up with in terms of their analysis. These are kind of interesting. Ammonia is 2,557,093 grams. And I converted that to tons of greenhouse gases per ton. So that's 2.88 tons of greenhouse gases per ton of fertilizer. So, I mean, it's really pretty dramatic.
Yeah, because your unit there, the 2.5 million, that's in grams. So then
Right.
when you convert it to tons, okay, so 2.8 tons of CO2 equivalents per ton of fertilizer that you apply. Oh, wow.
So I mean, now that's a real shock value. 2.57 million grams doesn't mean a lot to people, but when you say 2.8 tons, urea is at 1.3, but even like a herbicide and insecticide is that we're talking about 18 grams per gram of herbicide. So if you go back to that last figure and we talk about the energy coming in per product, is that they have a large, everything that we do as inputs has a large carbon footprint in terms of greenhouse gas equivalents. Energy, diesel and electricity is fairly efficient in terms of grams per BTU that's out there. So, but it's the products that we put in. So
Yeah.
You start thinking about all of these pieces and what our manufacturing process is, that we can start looking at these values. And so, and there's a whole long list of those. I didn't put them in all of them in here, but they give you examples. Mitchell.
But especially for the ammonia and urea, the reason that those are so big as the nitrogen fertilizer is it's not just the footprint when it's applied on the field, but what's the breakdown of the manufacturing of that nitrogen fertilizer? Because the Haber-Bosch process, all that, like that's where they just get hammered on this, right? Or do you know what the breakdown is of like the manufacturing process versus the footprint when it's in the field?
The manufacturing process is actually the big part of this overall piece out there. The distribution and application on the field is relatively minor compared to the production process. Um, and so you get into that. The other part of it, and we'll get into that when we talk about the emissions coming out. But that's I think that now gets into the real point of saying, yeah, can we be more efficient? Can we do trade-offs in terms of forms of fertilizer that might have a smaller footprint as well? So
But this is why they're pushing so much on the green ammonia and stuff like that, and how it's manufactured.
Yep.
We've got a new flux tower that we just put out last week, where we're going to be looking at greenhouse gas exchanges coming out of our soils. But if the big piece of the carbon footprint is actually before it even gets to my farm, I don't have as much control besides reducing the overall amount that I buy or trying to find alternative sources.
Yep.
Interesting. Okay.
So if you look at and now we get into just some of the pieces that are in these puzzles that nitrogen fertilizer that's put on there, and nitrous oxide, and 300 times in terms of the greenhouse gas equivalents, is that a lot of work has been done over time looking at how much emission goes on per unit of nitrogen applied out there. And by climate, wet it would be the Corn Belt, dry would be west of the Missouri River in terms of this. Basically, rough of the envelope calculation is 1% of the nitrogen fertilizer goes back as nitrous oxide. And so, and if you get in a dry climate, that's 0.5% in all of this. The dynamics of this, and that's what was often referred to in the International Panel on Climate Change. That 1% is their tier 1 calculations. That's just a simple math relationship, and all of this. It has a lot of asterisks with it in terms of nuances about this overall piece, because when you get into more sophisticated models of how nitrous oxide is behaving, yeah, you have to incorporate soil water into it, because nitrous oxide emissions out of the soil, and that's why there's such a big difference between wet and dry, is a direct function of water-filled pore space. So poorly drained soils are going to have more potential for nitrous oxide emissions. Well-drained soils are going to have less nitrous oxide emissions. So that the 1% goes away when we start looking at the factors that are involved in all of this. And then they also go away when we start looking at forms of fertilizer. So enhanced efficiency fertilizers that are stabilized show less emissions of nitrous oxide coming out, just because we change the whole process within the soil.
Should we basically think of this as volatilization, or is that a different thing?
That's an entirely different thing.
Okay.
The volatilization process is really that direct loss of that fertilizer from the surface into the atmosphere.
Okay.
And whereas nitrous oxide emissions, you have all this process going on that we've now converted that ammonia to nitrate, to the part of it into nitrous oxide that goes up coming out. The other piece of this, and I'll just interject in here, is why improving the soil has such a big impact on nitrous oxide. Because if we can keep that soil from being anaerobic, so if we keep it well drained, we have less potential for nitrous oxide. So any of the things that we do with regenerative ag in terms of improving our our soil structure, improving the water dynamics within that, have a positive impact on nitrous oxide. So, I mean, and so you, in addition to other things that it does for us, it does have a direct impact on nitrous, and it makes that nitrogen system more efficient. But you have to realize that those numbers are only 1%. So if we put on 140 pounds, we've only lost 1.4 pounds of fertilizer by nitrous oxide. We lose a lot more by leaching and everything else. But it is a place when we start looking at greenhouse gas, because of that 300 factor, we have a tremendous impact on our
That's what I was going to say. You take that 1.4 pounds times 300, and now you're talking 500. You're talking half a quarter of a ton.
Quarter of a ton. Yep.
So okay. So one other quick follow up on this. How wet is wet here? Because I'm thinking, what about rice type of wet soils? That's why they have such a high nitrous oxide impact, right? Like they're even beyond this level of.
Yeah.
Or are they the same?
No. Rice culture, flooded rice cultures, actually don't show a lot of nitrous oxide emissions because of the way they manage, but their biggest impact is methane.
Methane, yeah.
Yeah, because now we're flooded that soils. We've made methanogenesis the culprit in all of this. So rice production is really looked at much more from a methane, and they're managing nitrogen differently in that system. So nitrous oxide is not the big culprit there. But in rice production, here's another example. If you go and change that flooded rice condition to a drip irrigated system or a
row rice and stuff,
or dryland rice, methane emissions go away. And rice productivity actually doesn't change at all. So, I mean, we do it for weed control, but I think that rice production is one of the areas that we're looking at and saying, can we make some big changes in this that would have a tremendous impact?
Huge. You said ag is 10% of the carbon footprint, but rice alone is a huge component of ag's carbon footprint. I don't remember the number off the top of my head, but it's like 1 or 2% is just rice. Like 1 or 2 of the percentage of our total of 10, 1 or 2 of that is just rice.
Yep. The biggest emission, in fact, you bring that up, and I'll talk about our biggest emission from agriculture, if you look at the pie chart, is actually related to nitrogen management. That is about 50 to 60% of our total footprint. And then the next biggest one is methane production out of animals, and so enteric fermentation as well. Sure. So we get into this nitrous oxide, and here's where we talk about how we can start changing the dials. Enhanced efficiency fertilizers, as we talked about, give a reduction in nitrous oxide. We've seen this over and over again. We've run studies in Iowa and Colorado and a number of other states in a multi-state study that shows that that simple addition of adding enhanced efficiencies do reduce nitrous oxide emissions. You have to be a little bit cautious of that because there's a little bigger carbon footprint in manufacturing enhanced efficiency fertilizers that offset some of that reduction as well. The biggest one is just implementing the 4 R's. Anything that we can do with improving efficiency, right rate, right time, right form, right place. All of those have an impact on the efficiency and really change the nitrous oxide piece of this puzzle. The other one, in terms of this, and Mitchell mentioned alternate sources, moving away from the chemical fertilizers to manure application, or what I now refer to as bio-based fertilizers, or green manure crops that give alternate sources of N in that have a tremendous impact in terms of how do we effectively utilize alternate sources. And then the whole manufacturing process. And it was very interesting. The front page on the Des Moines Register yesterday, we talked about green ammonia in terms of using renewable energy in the manufacturing process. there's a lot of interest right now in in ammonia production coming from either gray or green ammonia. And if you look at that, it's just a matter of what are we using to supply the energy into that. And I think that here's an opportunity for us to look and say, yes, we need these forms in here, but can we become more efficient? And we'd have a tremendous impact on that 2.88 tons
Yeah.
of energy going, or greenhouse gas equivalents going into that ton of fertilizer that's out there.
So you've got gray and green, but there's also blue ammonia too, right?
Right. Yeah.
Like how would they just keep adding more colors of all
Oh
the
yeah. Well, we got a whole color spectrum we can
we
go
got a
through.
whole rainbow of ammonia options here.
But
Um,
gray and green are probably and green ammonia is probably the the best one to look at, because I think it's the most viable in terms of how do we produce ammonia out there.
so where's it coming from? Let's dig into it another step further because there is so many different pieces here. So green ammonia, that's coming from like the digesters and stuff, or where's the
Green ammonia is, we're taking still nitrogen out of the air. We have to realize that the atmosphere is 98 or 78% nitrogen.
yeah.
So we got a lot of nitrogen floating around. It's a matter of, in a Haber-Bosch process, is what we figured out was that you could take that under an intense energy process and create you take the nitrogen and then you got the hydrogen and create an NH3 out there. Well, that's driven by either
A bunch of natural gas.
natural gas that heated it all up. If you look at renewable energy, is what can you do with solar and wind power to create that? That's where he's just replacing the natural gas with renewable energy going into that production.
Mm.
So you got that piece of the puzzle.
Then you also have like using renewable natural gas though too.
Sure, you got renewable natural gas, you got all these different pieces in there. And so, is it going to be as efficient in terms of being able to get that heat that we want and all of that? Or do we think about supplementing natural gas with renewable energy and all of this? I think there's a lot to be worked out, but let our imaginations and our creativity start to come to figure out how we approach some of these problems that we know that we have to have nitrogen fertilizer going into our crop production. So how do we get there? How do we show that we can reduce that as well? And if you look at that nitrous oxide that we emit from nitrogen fertilizer, changing that would have a tremendous impact on agriculture's footprint. And so just by that 4R, say if we took a field that we knew parts of that field didn't need as much nitrogen, if we just reduced that rate across there by more precision application, we'd have a big impact on nitrous oxide because we're not wasting it. And we have even a bigger impact on water quality. So you got all those different pieces that come together. And so I think we have the science background and the understanding of this. Is a matter of getting it applied into agriculture. And that's where I think that the topsoil approach, Mitchell, in terms of looking.
Yeah, to be able to show what's the low hanging fruit.
Right. And
What's
there's
the
a lot of
low-hanging fruit?
hanging fruit.
Yeah.
And in precision agriculture, I'm not talking about changing rates at 1 square meter or 1 square yard across the field. We're talking about zones within the field that we might only have 2 or 3 zones that we can change that with and have a major impact both on productivity as well as environmental quality.
We in our previous webinar with CowsTube from our software team, we showed that we reverse engineered the GREET tool. And yeah, the biggest way to be able to reduce your score is add cover crop and then reduce your tillage. But then next is reduce your synthetic nitrogen and then reduce your diesel fuel. Now, overall, of course, improve your yield and your productivity because that's the denominator. So that helps significantly as well. But yeah, exactly. to your point, like we've got to be able to just capture some of this nitrogen that's already up in the atmosphere, do it with cover crops, do it with biology, so that way we can reduce. But it does take some time, I think, to be able to transition some of this stuff. Doesn't necessarily all happen right away, but at least knowing, okay, here's the low hanging fruit, I think is the best way to get farmers started. Because it seems to me a lot of farmers can lower their carbon intensity fairly easily within their current system, even if they're not ready to go all the way to adding cover crops or going to no-till. They can change some of these other things. Every single one of our farms can make some adjustments when it comes to our inputs.
Yep. And it's yeah, I mean, I think the nitrogen and the tillage intensity. I mean, if you look at the other piece of this puzzle is the soil carbon changes in that, and the DOE and the GREET model use the Century model to evaluate changes in soil organic carbon. And we all know that the Century model has some flaws. It's a fairly coarse model, but we do know that reducing tillage will decrease the emissions of CO2. And if we just simply change from a deep rip to in the field cultivator in the spring to a no-till system, is that we go from a negative carbon balance to a positive carbon balance in the first year. So, I mean, that changes it right there. The cover crops now begin to add to it in terms of not decreasing emissions, because what we're doing is we're constantly taking CO2 out of the air and we're putting into the soil. But with cover crops, if you go in and you can grow a fantastic cover crop, but if you go and till that cover crop in, you basically offset all the value of the cover crop. So you've got to look at the combination of reduced tillage, and then the cover crops continue to add to that. If you look at the GREET model, and Calstub talked about this, and is that we can sequester sufficient soil carbon that would basically offset the carbon footprint of energy inputs and nitrogen fertilizer and all of this. So now bringing these pieces together. So there are simple changes in terms of looking at nitrogen management across the field, looking at the reduced tillage and how you implement that. And then in reduced tillage, you've automatically reduced your energy inputs because you have less diesel going into that system. So all of these things come together in terms of the process that's out there. So let's just go to the next one.
That's right. That's where I like that it's holistic. But one last piece on this. It's interesting, that GREET. Okay, so we've been talking DOE, that's Department of Energy. GREET is the model, and like we said, we talked about it a lot in previous webinars. But for the soil organic carbon piece, which is directly influenced by what box you check and what cover crop you check, that's what I'm hearing is the biggest holdup currently in DC with how the IRS is going to take this 45Z tax credit and put it into play. That there's a lot of pushback on the SOC numbers here. And I agree. I think that just checking the cover crop box, there's no way it's accurate. And then the model that they built it on has plenty of pushback as well. Now, I hope that they still include it in this initial rendition of the tax credit, because we need all the options on the table. And why would you not want to incentivize adding cover crop and reducing tillage? But overall, this is a piece where we're going to have to really continue to improve these models.
Yeah, the Century model was not built to be that farm gate scale model out there. It was built to be much more of a general model. We're looking right now as can we build field scale carbon models that are much more accurate, incorporate a lot of this, but incorporate these ideas or the concepts of reduced tillage. We still have the piece that fields have multiple soils in them. All soils are going to respond a little differently. And how we manage it out there. But we have the tools now. We have high resolution pieces. So if you think about all of this and the structure of the CI model, it's just 1, 2, 3, and 4. You think about 1 is all the inputs. And if you look at the GREET model, is that the inputs that go into that is we know what grain yield is coming out because farmers get that. And then we have all the energy inputs. We have the fertilizer inputs. Well, those, as we've talked about, we can calculate how much the greenhouse gas impacts. We can get the soil organic changes out there. The Century model uses productivity and the pretty coarse farming practices that go into that. We just got the list of what they want in the climate smart projects in terms of documentation.
How many pages? Like 47 pages long.
It's 88 pages on the dictionary, and it's the spreadsheets are, I think, each 20 tabs on the spreadsheet, but being able to document changes in CO2 and methane and nitrous oxide and all of this over all the different practices by field in which we're doing these things. So at the end of 5 years, we ought to have a good understanding of at least how things are changing out there. Number two is, we know what the inputs are because, we track all those. And then we can obviously, using the numbers out there, can get the carbon or greenhouse gas intensities of the inputs. You got energy and then you got material. You can bring those together. Three, we can look at what's changed in soil organic carbon out there. And as Mitchell and I both said, that that's a pretty coarse estimate, but the results come out in two different ways in the GREET model, with and without the soil organic carbon. And so it gives you a feedstock CI score. So we know what the yield is, we know what the inputs are in terms of greenhouse gas, gets us back into that simple idea that, we can compute a score very quickly in all of this. But let's go to the next one, because I think this now gets into the heart of this. The carbon intensity is very simply inputs versus outputs. And if you think about this, it's very simple in terms of, think about the CI score as some sort of surrogate for profitability. You think about profit, how much, if you want more profit, what do? You either improve how much you put out, or you reduce the inputs that you had into the system out there. And the same thing with the CI score. We can either reduce the inputs or we can increase the output. And if you start looking at all of this in terms of these dynamics, is that understanding that we have options in terms of the inputs. And I think that's a lot of the low-hanging fruit that we have out there. Nitrogen management, tillage management, cover crops that we relate to regenerative agriculture. And if you look at the input scores, we can begin to do this. The outputs are really yield. And if we look at this, we know that changing these practices over time improves our yield. And I think the other piece of this is that you have to realize that when we start looking across fields, as we change all of these components, is that we lift the overall yield of that field. And so when we increase the overall field average, we made a tremendous impact on our CI score, because we don't have those low parts of that field dragging us down. And I think that's getting producers to understand their spatial variation in yield out there, and where they're having a lot of input with relatively low return on investment. Now we talk about ROI, yield relative to the inputs that are out there, and really critically analyzing a field over time. Look at this, because I know Mitchell and his dad have seen, and we've seen in other places, that as we've improved that, our fields are becoming more uniform. As they become more uniform, the overall yield is up, and so the CI score is going down naturally in all of this, even with no change in inputs. And so if you want to even get it to the next level, is you just start changing your inputs as well.
Yeah, and I'm sure even the ancillary impact too that we're not even picking up because of the granularity of the tool. But yeah, those buffalo wallows in those areas that were causing those drown out spots and those issues that would have been losing a lot of that input that we put out there. Now we can actually produce something off it, and it's on just a liability. But this piece here brings us back to where you started, which is carbon, nitrogen, and water cycles all being tied together. And some of the pushback on this that the yield is going to be different on every field and different every year. And whether you get the rain or don't get the rain, or the weather impact is going to cause for potentially massive differences in your farm's carbon output. But that's also why these metrics are going to end up being regionalized, that it's basically your score against kind of your local supply shed area, your local geography. But also it does cause for, yeah, there's multiple pieces that can influence this score, and it's going to look different out there in Kansas versus in Southeast Iowa versus, down in the Delta or wherever. But
I could see building a CI score that's a little bit like proven yield history. And when you start looking at 5 years of CI scores instead of a single year, and start saying, here's where my CI has been over time compared to county average CIs. And because we have yield levels at the county, we kind of know the inputs on a county level basis that we can get from ARM data from ERS. And so I think there's a lot of progress yet to be made in how we do all this.
That's a really good point, though, to be able to get showing that farm's overall score, and having a little bit of hedging in within it is probably the right thing. It's just, we got to have a lot more data ran through to be able to start populating those. But you could even just go back right now, and we can populate historical data as well to show field by field historically what the carbon intensity was. So, I mean, it could all absolutely be done. So,
yeah, it's not an impossible task. It's a matter of realizing that what's the and I'll come back to what's the ROI of building that information out on a field basis, and what return will that be for the producer out there. But you put all this science into action. I mean, changing efficiency of input, yes, is going to decrease our CI score without any change in yield. The efficient use of nitrogen fertilizers, because of that 300 factor, is a major impact in all of this. But then the soil organic carbon is kind of an offset. It gives decreased CO2 emissions, but you have decreased fuel inputs. We do get the increased productivity over time, and then we get the increased fuel uniformity. And the last piece, I think, is an area that we can really push with producers, is how do you make that field more efficient by really understanding the spatial dynamics within the field, and realizing that drowned out spot is a major source of methane in the spring out of the Midwest. It's a major source of nitrous oxide in a lot of areas. And so spatially evaluating and understanding that field will pay us major dividends in the CI score as we look at this. So I think there's a great path forward that we can start working with producers on two fronts. One is the CI score, and the other one is their overall profitability in their own operation without even the CI score out there. I think the CI score may give us an incentive to get here, but realizing that a lot of this will just return profit to the producer as well. So I think there's multiple things that we need to start a major educational effort that these things are not that complex. They just need to be understood and put into practice.
No, that's totally it. And so part of with that, and if anyone else has any questions, this has been amazing for me to be able to ask questions and just learn so much. But but yeah, as people have to start understanding this, I'm assuming you know a lot of the guys over there at the Argonne National Lab. Dr.
Yeah.
Michael Wong, I think, is one of the main authors and stuff. Are those guys just freaking out over there right now? Of like, holy crap, we need to hire like hundreds of people, and we need to have a lot more robustness in there because, like, at least in my eyes, before August of last year, and really before January of this year, nobody had ever even heard of argon. Nobody had heard of GREET. Nobody heard of carbon intensity, at least like the typical farmer and stuff. And now it's like, it is the thing. Are they just freaking out over there?
Well, I'm sure that they're just going bananas in terms of how how do I implement and how do I improve this model so that I'm not getting beat up every day by people
Yeah. Yeah.
in the hole. But I think that in all of this is you have to realize that this is a talking point, and it's an area that we can make progress in, but realize that we have improvements to do. I mean, there's no such thing as a perfect soil test. There's no such thing as a perfect farming system. And so, but I still go back to the fact that we have a lot of capability with our science right now to be able to move forward very quickly, because we've got tools now in terms of spatially looking at fields, temporally looking at fields that we didn't have 5 or 10 years ago. And so we can put those into practice and have a tremendous impact.
Yeah, totally agree. And yeah, obviously that's where we want to help too, is helping to really dial this in, providing recommendations, helping with the tracking and verification. We're going to dig a lot more into this at our TopSoil Summit coming up. We do have a webinar, I believe, that we're doing next week as well with Elizabeth Burns Thompson. She's with Navigator. They're tied in on one of the pipeline projects, but going to talk on the policy side of things and looking at scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 reductions, how this can all tie in. But we've got time maybe for a quick one question if somebody's got one. I'm sure there's a bunch. I'm sure especially Carolyn and Sophie, I'm sure have a lot of them for you and some of your discussions. But Lauren, I'm sure you've got it all totally understood. You're probably no issues on your side. Easy peasy.
Oh, I was, if you want a question quick, I was paying attention particularly to the drying and infrastructures. How does that factor into our carbon intensity score?
Oh, the drainage system and everything. I
No,
think
drying.
Grain drying.
drying. That's post farm gate. And so this is raw product coming off of that, and then you start putting the drying into processing after it leaves. It hasn't left the farm, but it's not considered as in the raw production process.
But so you're thinking though that the as part of like the GREET tool, it asks for natural gas, it asks for electricity. Would we not put drying into that, or can we put it in there? We just need to note where that line in the sand got drawn.
Right. Yeah, we can put it in there. I mean, it's quite easy to do. It's just not in this calculation structure. It's just downstream a little bit.
Got it. Yeah, because we're looking at documenting some of that.
Right.
And Lauren, maybe that's what you're referring to as well with the Haber guys, Haber Technologies, and looking at having actual autonomous systems that can be plugged in to our grain drying setup to be able to help us to document the actual usage of electricity when we're running our fans, and then also in the drying system. So I know that's one of the things we're looking at least being able to better document, because there's technology to do it, and we know we're going to have to at some point. So we can
there's been even we've developed some models to start looking at how rapidly that corn's going to dry down, beans are going to dry down, in terms of maybe optimizing that harvest out there, in terms of reducing that energy input as well. So
sure.
Just multiple tools that keep getting developed. We just need to get them applied. So
all going to keep tying together. Well, Jerry, thanks for taking the time. This has been super insightful. I'm glad I got to just ask you questions here for an hour. I'm sure there'll be a lot more conversation to be had. This whole space has a long way to continue to develop, and glad to be working on the cutting edge with you. So
Yep.
appreciate you.
it's an exciting area.